Even as the combat occurring in southeast Houston was coming to its end, as PLA forces from the 113th and 60th Combined Arms Brigades, an armored battalion from the 60th, and a mechanized infantry from the 113th were rolling up the last American combat forces in the area, within the core metro area, to the immediate south in League City and Dickinson. A 5-hour-long battle carried out by the PLAN Marines was occurring within this area, which had essentially forced anybody that had survived, as they methodically went through this relatively large sprawl of city, to flee to the immediate west into Alvin, having to cross the Bayou Wildlife Refuge to move the short distance from League City / Dickinson into Alvin, Texas, whereupon a relatively large grouping of armed reactionary civilians, as well as other remnants of the American Armed Forces, namely Coast Guard forces, naval forces that had fled Texas City, Texas, and then League City as well, along with the remnants, a very tiny amount of gun crews, one of the FDC sections from one of the batteries, and a fuel truck and fueler had fled also after a Tu-22M had carpet munitioned much of the 1st of the 141st out of existence, itself an artillery battalion, part of the 256th Infantry Brigade combat team that had been moved into the area along with the 2nd of the 156th, itself a mechanized infantry battalion that had been smashed in the Channel View area by other PLA forces. As by now, as the combat was entering its final phases, the People's Armed Police were methodically going through the last remaining buildings in downtown and clearing them, while the rest of their troops fought out on the streets, clearing the streets of any and all armed resistance in the downtown area, along with PLA forces that had made their way into the downtown as well. As the last bit of fighting occurring in the very tiny remaining stretch of downtown was occurring from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., by 2:30 p.m. to the literal immediate south, just off this core metro area map, the PLAN 1st Marine Brigade had conducted a 2-hour logistical resupply after the 5-hour fight that had occurred in League City / Dickinson to prepare for their sickle-like push to the south of the core metro area and its outermost suburbs, of which Alvin, a moderately sized town of some nearly 30,000 people, not quite a city, but it was definitely a large town, where resistors had essentially decided to make their last stand, including even the remnants of the 1st of the 141st, and of course the Coast Guard and naval personnel who had fled Texas City and League City, along with the 1st of the 141st remnants into Alvin as well, that was literally just to the south of the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade's positions on the core metro area map, as Highway 6, a state highway, continued from here and into Alvin, which was literally just off the map in this area, where League City was a very short distance of merely several miles from it. And the 1st PLAN Marines would be given the honor of wrapping up all of the combat occurring in the entire metro area by going after the last remaining American stronghold, and thus preventing this relatively large group of armed combatants from becoming a partisan uprising after the occupation was to set in, as this could become a nuisance for the establishment of colonization operations and beginning to build the red zone in downtown, as well as connecting it to the other areas of vital economic importance, at least within the Houston metro area. As the last Tu-22M heavy strategic bomber that had not, as of the moment, dropped its massive 53,000 pounds of HE payload had been diverted to smash the Richmond city, which itself was also an outer suburb to the immediate southwest of the core metro area, as well as massive artillery barrages coming from the artillery battalion of the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, equipped with its potent PLZ-05 155mm howitzers, ruthlessly shelling the area. And with the Tu-22Ms being prepared for their next sortie, as it took more time to prepare these aircraft for their missions than it did the fighter aircraft. By the time the battle in Houston ended, the three different fighter squadrons present, the J-20 fighter squadron with its accompanying FH-97A stealth fighter drones, as well as the Russian VVS Su-27 squadron with a few of the aircraft equipped with the Kibini jamming systems for electronic warfare in the local area, as well as also the J-10 squadron returning to do their third and final sortie and provide the PLAN Marine troops with close air support as well as strike missions against these American positions, as these J-10s would return carrying a mixture of free-fall munitions and precision munitions such as the Baidu guided bombs, which were essentially Chinese GPS-guided weapons, as well as also air-to-ground missiles and laser-guided munitions as well from the J-10s and the J-20s, FH-97As, stealth fighter drones with the J-20s, and also the Russian aircraft carrying their own mixture of air-to-ground munitions. Although they would carry limited air-to-air munitions now that the air threat had been completely and totally neutralized, that was simply standard operating procedure to carry 2 air-to-air missiles by this point in time, as they can now become strike aircraft now that the air threat had been completely removed from the American forces, as these aircraft would drop punishing payloads onto targets below and assist the PLAN Marines in their operations as they conducted their drive to the west from the League City / Dickinson area to roll up again the last remaining real American resistance, as these PLAN Marine forces, now having fully unloaded from the captured port facilities in Texas City, Texas, earlier seized by their recon and also Air Asslt battalions comprising companies, they had unloaded their main maneuver forces, which consisted of a heavy, medium, and light combined arms battalion, within which, in the heavy battalion, there was a headquarters and support company, there was a combat engineer company, and there was the 2 light tank / assault gun companies equipped with their ZBD-05 or Type 05 assault gun / light tank amphibious versions of the vehicle, with the 3 infantry companies essentially being heavy infantry companies equipped with strictly the IFV versions of these vehicles, which had a different turret with a 30mm autocannon, an HJ-73C anti-tank missile on the IFV version, as well as also a coax machine gun, a 7.62 by 54mm, just as there was on the assault gun / light tank version with its 105mm rifled tank gun, and the turret-based machine gun as well, the 12.7mm W85 heavy machine gun. And as the Marines also had their Air Asslt Bttn, which consisted of 4 Air Assault infantry companies, also their combat aviation company with its 2 flying platoons of 5 Z9WAs each, as well as also the transport company with their 10 total Z-18 transport helos, such as these, would be dropping off the air assault troops to cut off any conceivable retreat by the American forces, if it were even possible and such a thing could be conducted. These air assault troops would fly in behind the advance of their heavier forces that would begin to surround and clear the town from the direct east moving west, as they would essentially fall in on the north of the town, come in from the east of the town, as well as also from the south, while the air assault troops would be rapidly flown in behind the town before even the heavy units could fully surround it, and would be dropped off again to cut off the retreat of the Americans if they were even trying to do so, as the Americans had totally lacked any sort of ISR capabilities, as all of this was removed at midnight with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as the electronic warfare jamming that occurred in local areas, including within the Battle of Houston by the Kibini-equipped Russ1an VVS aircraft of the Su-27 squadron, specifically committed and earmarked for just this battle, as they would return as well for their final sorties of the operation. They would be once again jamming any types of redundant communications like radio and other forms of communications, as the PLAN Marines, in a manner very similar to many battles that occurred in Vietnam, would be used as a way to again cut off any type of retreat, and they would have ample support from their attack helo gunships, as one of the two flying platoons would be serving as an air platform version of artillery, as they would fire their 57mm rocket pods, which would devastate enemy forces, as well as also their anti-tank missiles and their 23mm autocannon turret, as these forces would also have dedicated Marines that have been trained on using the single tube version of the CH-901A loitering munition, as they did not have a dedicated drone section with a TEL-like system that could fire 48 at a time. They were still capable of using the single tube versions and firing a small number of them to support their troops in a close-in tactical sort of way, as they also had their squad and vehicle crew-based ISR assets at the most local of levels in the form of their quadcopter recon helos that scouted the battlefield ahead for them. They were equipped in the same manner as the PLA forces and even the PAP forces operating in the Houston battlefield, by having each vehicle crew and each squad possessing a quadcopter reconnaissance drone, which would feed back the data into the central AI system that all of the PLA forces, whether PLA ground forces or the Army, whether the Navy, their Marines, and Air Force, PLAAF, all utilized and were coordinated through in terms of their activities, and even able to coordinate with the foreign allies like the Russians, the Pakistanis, and many others, including Iranians. And this AI system made these forces extremely efficient and highly flexible, and also they performed extremely safe in terms of preventing friendly fire incidences due to this technology. As the PLAN Marines also had their artillery ashore to support their own forces, their 122mm artillery, which was self-propelled in the form of the PLZ-07, was not quite as potent shell per shell as was the larger 152 and 155mm artillery, or definitely not the 203mm artillery, which was the largest possessed, but the 122, when used in concentrated fire, could be highly destructive and would be adequate to support their own forces. And if they needed heavier guns, they could always call upon the PLA, whose 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade was already horribly shelling the city of Richmond after the Tu-22M had carpet munitioned most of the city out of existence, which, for the surviving armed combatants that would have tried to make a stand there, this had scared them into moving out of the area completely by causing them to move to the east into Alvin or directly south, as they could not move west, as literally right off the map in this area. Group armies of the external prong of PLA Group Armies of 15 through 20 were literally just right off the map, moving up to Interstate 10, whereupon they would shed the 15th Group Army at the new megafob established by the PAP and PLA logistical forces of the 83rd Support and Sustainment Brigade, which would give the 83rd time to be replaced and conduct its rest and refit briefly before proceeding into northeast Texas from Houston, as the 83rd would continue to wrap up the battle, as well as the PLAN Marine 1st Brigade, who would remain in the area even after the 83rd left, and the other group army, the 15th, had come in to replace them, as the PAP's 36th Brigade would also remain as a very capable and destructive crack elite counterinsurgency force to crush the uprisings that they were sure would appear after their victory. However, there would be a lull in the fighting after the victory in Houston before the partisans would begin to resist in full once the news had been spread of the official surrender by the national regime over the loudspeakers that would be blaring the address that would have been given by the Secretary of State, as that was the senior official chosen to give the surrender announcement, and it would be translated in Mandarin as well as Russian and other languages of the coalition, while the Secretary of State read the surrender message in English. And this would be played all throughout the nation by day 4 of the invasion, as in the Cap City, the battle, which would last several days, would hit its critical phase early on the 4th day, which would result in the final surrender of the nation, of its regime. But its people would not surrender and would continue to fight the good fight, as it was called. Immediately south of the positions of the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade sat the town of Alvin, Texas. And as the League City / Dickinson area, immediately down I-45 here, was relatively near to Alvin, only several miles across the Bayou Wildlife Refuge area, the PLAN Marine forces were already beginning to close on the town from 3 different directions, while their air assault troops were being dropped off behind the only line of retreat out of town as the heavier forces moved in from the east, moving west to conduct their major final maneuver of the campaign. As PAP forces were wrapping up the battle in the downtown area and, again, methodically clearing every building that even was still standing in the downtown, the battle at Alvin would begin an hour after the last fighting in downtown had begun at 2 p.m. with a renewed push by the PAP as well as PLA forces entering. The battle at Alvin would begin at 3 after the logistical resupplying of a 2-hour resupply period taken by the forces of the PLAN Marines before they were to conduct their last major push. Alvin was in an area that had an intersection of state highways. There was State Highway 35, and then there was State Highway 6, which again ran all the way to the southeast and connected to the roads in the Texas City, Texas area within that city, and ran all the way diagonally to the northwest into the core metro area itself. Highway 6 would have continued just like so and led into the core metro area, as well as also the State Highway 35, and they intersected at this point right here, which would have looked very similar to this type of intersection, where there's an elevated highway on stilting and one on the ground below it. As abandoned cars littered the roads and even the sides of roads and people's yards all over the core metro area and beyond, sites like this were common as the PLAN Marines pushed forward in their very potent strike forces, their maneuver elements of their 3 combined arms battalions, heavy, medium, and light, as well as also using their reconnaissance battalion, one of the lightest of their forces, as well as also their air defense artillery battalion, now lacking any air targets as America no longer possessed anything airworthy to have to defend against. The Air Defense Artillery Battalion and the Recon Battalion would be utilized to defend the complete logistical routes to the line of contact all the way back to the port facilities in Texas City, Texas, as in all the way down Route 6 here. And this would enable the supplies coming from the Type 075 helo carrier that was actually belonged to the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade operating in the area, as that was where its Air Asslt Bttn and Recon Battalion were based off of that vessel, as well as also cargo vessels bringing in supplies for the PLAN Marine troops, which would be driven up Route 6 from Texas City, Texas, to liaison with all the headquarters platoons of each and every company and distribute the ammunition, food, fuel, water, and maintenance parts and anything else required for the mission. As the ZBD-05 assault gun / light tank amphibious company, as there were 2 of these companies within the heavy combined arms battalion, with 3 of the heavy armored infantry companies as well within the battalion. There was also the combat engineers, the mortar company or fire support company, and the headquarters and support company within just this battalion. And in this area of northeast Alvin, there essentially was only 2 of the battalion's companies in just this area, with more, of course, to the north and south, as well as 2 other additional maneuver battalions, being the light and medium battalions. However, the heavy battalion was chosen to attack in the center, while the medium battalion would swing north and the lighter battalions would swing south. All battalions' elements, of course, being equipped with the ZBD-05 / Type 5, although there were 3 main versions. There was the assault gun / light tank version. There was the IFV version, which again had a 30mm autocannon on a turret with a 7.62x54 coax, W85 heavy machine gun, and an HJ-73C anti-tank missile on the IFV version, with the APC version simply having a machine gun turret for a heavy W85 machine gun. There was also the command vehicle version of this vehicle, which was in the headquarters platoons, and also an armored ambulance version as well for the Marines, which even had 4 bunk beds with 2 on each side, with the ability to care for critical care patients 4 at a time in this capacity. And, of course, a lot of medical equipment could be stored within as well by the combat medics that operated these vehicles out of the headquarters platoons. And as the specially trained Marines trained to operate the single tube system of the CH-901As would be utilizing them in the battle, the relatively lower number of loitering munitions would still play an important role by the PLAN Marines. And of course, they could always call upon their PLA brethren, who had their TEL-like systems in each headquarters battalion, to fire even larger volleys. But again, even though the numbers deployed by the Marines of loitering munitions were relatively much smaller than that of the PLA, their attack helo gunships more than made up for this discrepancy, as they could carry quite a punch per Z9WA, as they possessed their 23mm autocannon, they possessed their 57mm rocket pods, one on each side, and they also possessed the ability to carry multiple anti-tank missiles as well. And that essentially ensured that they packed an enormous punch, as well as also the ground-based vehicles, including this 105mm rifled tank gun on this assault gun / light tank. Although it was a relatively lower recoil tank gun, rifled tank gun, it was still very destructive and had different types of ammunition to choose from, which could be utilized as an assault gun direct fire weapon / light tank, as it could destroy still a wide array of vehicles with this weapon. As group armies 15 through 20 were moving up the highways, state highways, to connect to I-10 and take it all the way into the American Southeast, the 15th Group Army would relieve the 83rd, as mentioned before, and this movement of these group armies prevented escape from Richmond by the armed reactionary elements that were to the south of this area, in the Richmond area, prevented them from moving immediately to the west, so their only options were to go south or east into Alvin, and many went into Alvin, and were now increasingly becoming trapped by this strategic masterstroke of basically getting all of these forces into one area and decimating them in a concentrated number, as again, this would aid in the overall grand strategy of the colonization and economic exploitation that was to occur once the battle had been won. There was a forward deployed artillery battery moved a bit forward ahead of the others that were still sitting in League City / Dickinson, to enable them to fire even further to the west as it pertained to the PLAN Marines. And as they were not firing into the town itself per se, they were firing on the opposite side of town as terrain denial missions to prevent escape until the PLAN Marines in their Air Asslt Bttn could drop off one company at first to secure the area, utilizing their Z-18 transport helo company to get them in there with 5 or 1 platoon, essentially, of their helo gunships, their Z9WAs, supporting them with heavy fire into the area, along with airdrop munitions coming from the J-10 squadron, as also the Su-27 squadron of the Russ1an VVS could have been used in this capacity, as could have the J-20s, now returning armed with air-to-ground munitions, as well as their accompanying fighter drones, the FH-97As, paired to each and every fighter. But the J-10s would be carrying a significant payload and would be utilized heavily, flying their final sortie in the battle in support of the PLAN Marines as they drop their payloads all throughout the town and outside of it, on anyone attempting to escape especially. As now these forces began moving in, the Americans had set up the best defense they could for lacking communications and ISR capabilities, as again, the tiny shattered remnants of the 1st of the 141st, an artillery battalion that had been carpet munitioned in League City by one of the Tu-22Ms, had left very few survivors in a similar circumstance to what had occurred here with these 2 battalions, or squadrons rather, the 1st of the 278th ACR and of course the 1st of the 98th Cav, as they had been hit by this Tu-22M while trying to attack these PLA forces. Essentially, a similar event happened in League City, where a massive Tu-22M strategic air raid used in a tactical capacity had annihilated most of their battalion. That battalion, as part of the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, as was the 2nd of the 156th, a mechanized infantry battalion. Both were out-of-state elements, just like the 1st of the 98th Cav and even the 2nd of the 114th, which was also like the 1st of the 98th Cav from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, whereas the 1st of the 141st and the 2nd of the 156th came from the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, and were also part of the larger 36th ID, just like the 278th ACR and its other subordinate units. As the remains of the artillery forces, which were primarily a towed artillery battalion equipped with one battery that had M777 howitzers, with the other 2 firing batteries equipped with the M119A3s, which were 105 millimeter howitzers. These forces had, upon fleeing League City after the heavy carpet munitioning, and they were temporarily obscured from view by the fact that an oil storage tank had basically gone up in a blaze and had created a lot of smoke over the area for a short time. They were able to use this to flee into Alvin, wherein they had moved into thickly wooded areas and set up their howitzers as such, as this wooded area across the street from this house here in northeast Alvin was used as a position for the gun 2 LMTVs, which carried the few remaining shells they even had available, as well as powders, fuses, and primers and such, as well as an FDC vehicle, essentially an M113 high top with equipment in it for the FDC. They had escaped and gone into this thickly wooded area, but they would be discovered as anything that moved and was spotted could be annihilated, as would be this M777, and although it would get off a good shot, as the rough calculations having to do gunnery the old way, essentially with aid of people fleeing the area, informing them on where the headquarters platoon had set up for the assault gun / light tank company, 1 of 2 within the heavy combined arms battalion, would enable them to fire a 155 shell directly at them, which would actually destroy a few of their vehicles and cause some KIAs among their troops as the shell splashed in the area. However, immediately upon so doing, the attack helos from 1 of the 2 flying platoons of the Combat Aviation Company within the Air Asslt Bttn would put down heavy fire with anti-tank missiles into this wooded area where the M777 had fired from originally, as they would fire their AKD-10 anti-tank missiles into this wooded area, as would this Z9WA firing 4 anti-tank missiles into this wooded area and this wooded area upon the ISR assets of the quadcopter recon drones, scouring the area, having had found them in the woods. And although the woods were thick, and at first it was difficult to see them, even with the high-altitude recon drones, these WZ-8s, also the satellite image overlay, as it all overlaid to create the ultimate view from the satellite all the way to high altitude, all the way to the lowest altitude. The quadcopters were very effective at getting in there and finding things that the higher altitude assets might not see right away. And as they could spot movement in these wooded areas, the ISR imagery processed by the AI and going back to the combat data links informed these pilots and gunners that there were enemy combatants in these wooded areas, and thus they would be fired upon with their anti-tank guided missiles, as well as their 23 millimeter autocannon and rockets that would be fired by these forces as well. As the chemical plant in northern Alvin was located right here, this would become one of the local strong points of the defending forces, as again, the defenders were a hodgepodge, a mixture of surviving military elements, primarily the 1st of the 141st, as well as some from the Navy and Coast Guard that had fled the earliest combat and had found temporary refuge in Alvin, as well as also even some paramilitary forces from the local SWAT-like elements in the area, as well as also over 2,500 armed reactionary civilians, comprising all combined a total of several thousand defenders, as all of them had no central command above them to coordinate them or organize them. They lacked communications, except very close quarters communications, such as hand gestures and yelling up and down the line of troops or vehicles. That was all they had to work with. But they would make up for it in their tenacity in trying to defend, and even getting clever with one of their means of defense, storing a gun crew and howitzer, storing their M119A3 inside of this garage that normally was an oil change / garage that worked on vehicles, using the garage door to fire between this alleyway and into a PLAN vehicle, one of their IFVs. As again, this company here was a heavy armored infantry marine company using the IFVs only, strictly the IFV versions of these ZBD-05s, which had the 30mm autocannon, the HJ-73C anti-tank missile, as well as the coax, and of course the turret machine gun. These forces attacking in these very powerful infantry fighting vehicles would be assaulting the American lines held along this drainage ditch on the other side of this creek, which ran through the town and continued for a ways to the immediate west before bending and moving north. As this was a defining geographical feature, there were many wooded areas spread out throughout this entire map. There was rail infrastructure in terms of freight rail that ran underneath this stretch of Highway 35, the state highway, and across this street where there was a bridge across the creek, and it ran by the chemical plant and then continued onward. As the local community college in Alvin was immediately to the south and off this map, there was another heated battle erupting there, as another of the 3 heavy armored infantry companies of the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion was immediately to the south of this company, with its light tank / assault gun company operating here, with its other assault gun / amphibious light tank company operating even further to the south, as there was this heavy armored infantry company, another one immediately south of that, and then their other of 2 assault gun / light tank amphibious companies, and their third and final heavy armored infantry company was immediately to the north of this company. And then again, the medium Combined Arms Battalion operated to the north and the light to the south, which the light used essentially the APC version of this vehicle with the machine gun turrets, and they each had one IFV, only one IFV per platoon, instead of the entire makeup of the platoons being strictly IFVs, as they, again, in this heavy Combined Arms Battalion, were essentially much more heavily equipped than were the light forces of the light Combined Arms Battalion. The medium was arrayed in similar fashion to the heavy, except it only had 1 light tank company instead of 2, and in place of that it had an extra armored infantry company in the medium battalion, Combined Arms Battalion. And of course, each of these battalions had their own combat engineer company within. They also, again, had their headquarters and support company, which was the logistics and command of the battalions, and they also had their mortar company, which was their own fire support company. There were no mortars being used in this area. mostly because the mortars were all concentrating, of the mortar company, were all concentrating on the area immediately south, where the fighting hit a fever pitch around the community college near Hillcrest, another tiny town that connected to Alvin, which was a larger town. This particular map was a 2-mile map by 1 mile north to south. This was a very large area, and a large portion of the town was already being shelled by Marine artillery being fired from further away, not by this company, or battery of their battalion, but by the other firing batteries that were still sitting further away in League City. The wildlife refuge, or the Bayou Wildlife Area, essentially went in this direction and connected Alvin to Dickinson / League City, as, again, there was a several-mile gap between this town, which basically League City and Dickinson were immediately off map right here, and Alvin was right here, merely just several miles away to the west. And essentially, this Bayou Wildlife Area extended from the city limits of Alvin in this area all the way to League City / Dickinson. And there were some farms in this area, some rural homes and farms. This farm had been destroyed as the Marines had taken fire from the farmhouse here with the driveway going into it, as you can see, as well as the barn, and they had been destroyed by the PLAN Marines firing their 30mm autocannons with their HE armor-piercing ammo, as well as also their fire vectored in from the ZBD-05 assault gun / light tanks firing their 105mm HE shells, which were picked as the shell of choice to destroy these buildings and those that were fighting from inside of them. As these houses had been cleared, except for this one, which they'd taken fire from and promptly returned fire and destroyed it, these houses had been cleared, and now these forces were about to press their main assault into the town with this platoon. And again, these can carry dismount squads that, although it's a light tank / assault gun, they can carry a squad in each of these vehicles. And they're moving up and into the area and taking position just under the highway right here, as this was an entrance ramp and this was another entrance ramp to the other side. There were exit ramps on either side down here that connected to this road that went under the highway and into town, and this road that went across the creek here and into town, just as this road here, and the highway exit ramps that connected to each of these roads, these two streets that ran parallel. And this was Highway 6 that ran all the way from Texas City, Texas, where the PLAN Marines started their operation by landing. This is a bridge over the highway. It ran all the way to the core metro area from Alvin, which again was literally just right here off the map. And the PLAN Marines, of course, wanted to take the highway infrastructure intact as easily as possible. While this gun crew had a remaining howitzer, another of their towed M119A3s, they, along with some paramilitary forces and civilian technicals, were moving through this area at the time where this artillery bombardment opens up the map. As this map opens up, there's mass artillery fires coming into this area from some of the other firing batteries sitting in League City, firing massive volleys of 122mm shells, concentrating their fire into this area and destroying these buildings massively, as the concentrated 122mm fire was still very highly destructive. And the American artillery, the lighter howitzers were 105mm, and the PLAN Marine howitzers of the PLZ-07 were 122mm, which were larger than the lighter American howitzers. But the American howitzers had the benefit of being easy to tow and lightweight. And the M777 was made to be a heavy howitzer that was likewise lightweight and easy to transport, and it was to a certain extent. However, it had certain types of parts that were prone to wearing out relatively quickly, and the howitzer could not sustain a high rate of fire for very long without having to have serious maintenance done upon it. And these parts would wear out relatively quickly. They were not really built to last. They were built to make money. As these forces here in the chemical plant were taking ample 57mm rocket fires coming from the Hilo gunships operating in this area, all of these rocket pods from these 3 of the 5 of the flying platoon of these Hilos from the Air Asslt Battalion's Combat Aviation Company were slamming into the fence line along this chemical plant outer perimeter fencing, and were blasting these vehicles and personnel to literal pieces, as there were many of them lined up in the prone position, laying along the terrain features that ran up against the fence, as well as others behind it. Again, this was a chemical plant that is in North Alvin, or Northeast Alvin rather, and they were using it as a hard point. And there were some paramilitary and military vehicles, including their one fueler that had escaped, and now they were being heavily hit by the attack helo gunships with their rocket pods and anti-tank missiles, AKD-10s, being fired at these MRAPs right here and right here, which would shred an MRAP to pieces, of course. Even 57mm rocket fire, if using the right rockets, the armor-piercing variety, could do the same. As now, these forces moved into position along the Route 6 highway, moving in to cover the main assault by these 2 platoons of their company, moving into the area, 1 platoon stopping here, before continuing on again. This platoon moved straight up this road underneath this Route 35, or State Highway 35, elevated highway segment, as they were engaging enemy forces in the area, firing their very potent main armaments, their 105mm rifled low recoil tank guns, into these buildings. The house, the silo, and the barn were taking heavy fire from these vehicles, including those that had moved in from beneath here, as they could arc their fire into this area as well, while these forces were here, and this platoon was only right here on the other side of the highway. As they fired their very potent shells into this wooded area right here where they were taking fire from, and the trees that were adjacent to the Highway 6, as this bridge went over the highway, they also fired on these buildings and laid waste to them before they would turn their attention as they began receiving fire from the other side of the highway along this access road that abutted the highway on this side within the town limits. They essentially were using this highway segment as a fighting position by being on the access road above the highway where the bridge was, and trying to prevent the PLAN Marines from moving into town, because they knew once they got into town, then all bets were off, as the saying goes, because then they would be able to methodically go through and clear their strong points one by one. So some of the Americans had essentially put it upon themselves to try to hold off these forces as much as possible, while others would serve as runners, trying to run messages back and forth and coordinate some kind of coherent defense, although this was extremely difficult, as, again, these forces were led by no central authority, and cooperation was sometimes difficult, as everyone wanted to be a chief and nobody wanted to be an Indian, as the old saying goes. And as this was going on, the armored infantry forces of the heavy mechanized infantry that were part of this heavy combined arms battalion in this company here, as their headquarters, had parked their vehicles near the buildings destroyed, while a artillery battery of PLZ-07s was sitting here just on the map and firing terrain denial operations off map. These forces were now moving into place as well, as they had their Marines conducting double column rolling shields behind their IFVs. They were now moving into place, moving to the highway exit ramp right here, deploying their Marines out from behind their vehicle to lay down fire against the Americans entrenched on the other side of this drainage ditch, which would also end up being used as a fighting position by the Marines themselves as they moved in and began to storm these positions. Similar in this illustration to the Marines on either side of this vehicle storming American positions as they got closer, including a drainage ditch area just literally right off of this image, this illustration, this animation, if you will, with this Marine firing his QBJ-201 light machine gun into the positions as they moved in their tactical wedge formations, which were a great formation for maintaining fire, oriented toward the front but in different directions, able to cover their vehicles, which could also mutually support them as the turret gunner and, of course, the crew inside could fire the main weapon or coax if needed as well. And with a group of these vehicles working together with their different dismounted squads, with total gunship support, some loitering munition support, fast movers or their fighters repurposed as ground attack aircraft support, now that they had no more air threats to worry about, and more, these forces would initiate a very savage fight for this town. And as the platoon here began to move up individually into position, this gun crew would ultimately give themselves away and have counter battery fire come down upon them, as these imminent strike markers indicate. 122mm shells would slam and annihilate this city block. And there was a large number of armed reactionary civilian defenders inside of this building anyhow. And then there was the gun crew, an LMTV truck in this large garage building that had once been a maintenance/oil change garage. And they fired their 105mm shell over across the creek in a direct fire bore sighting manner, which slammed immediately into this ZBD-05 IFV, destroying it and actually KIAing the crew. The high velocity of this shell being fired from so close, not even a full mile away, slamming into the front of the vehicle in such a high velocity, destroyed this infantry fighting vehicle. As the infantry fighting vehicles were extremely well built and strong, they were not as strong as the PLA ground forces IFVs, as these were to be lighter, faster, and easier to maneuver and get ashore in, as these were amphibious capable vehicles. The assault gun was more heavily armored than the IFV, as ERA plating could be added to the turret and other parts of it, as shown. The IFV was likewise fairly well armored, although in the front, a high-velocity, fast-moving artillery shell could defeat the vehicle, and it did, as it slammed right into it and destroyed it and caused the crew to be taken out of commission along with the vehicle. The vehicle beside it had taken some of the shrapnel, but the shell, when it slammed into the vehicle, had basically punched into, before it detonated it, it went right through the frontal armor a bit and detonated and blasted while it was inside the vehicle. So the vehicle right next to it was only very mildly damaged, but it was enough to wipe out this crew. And the armored recovery and the ZBD-05 ambulance version, the armored ambulance version of this vehicle, which was in this headquarters platoon, both moved together, with this being the recovery vehicle and this being the armored ambulance. This one right behind it with the dot in the middle is the command vehicle version of the ZBD-05, of the command elements of the company. But the armored ambulance with the combat medics and the armored recovery vehicle now moved up to pull this vehicle and any potential survivors out of the path of the heavy fighting that was now breaking out. At which point, there were already massive losses on the American side, as these personnel were trying to resist with anything they had to fight with in terms of small arms. If they had anything like AT-4s available to them and they knew how to use them, or if they had Molotovs and other weapons, they were fighting with everything they had. And this will be continued in the next video, as this map and another following will conclude the Battle of Alvin and the battle in general in the Houston metro area, as the PLAN was moving in to conduct their final operations in the area.